Hi, everyone. This is Scott King. Thank you so much for joining Zimperium's latest webinar, Mobile Devices or Endpoints 2, featuring Ovum. Speaking with us today are Andrew Kellett of Ovum and John Michelsen of Zimperium. Our first speaker, Andrew Kellett. Andrew enjoys the challenge of working with state-of-the-art technology and is a member of the Ovum IT security team. He has the opportunity to evaluate and provide opinion on the latest security matters. He is responsible for research on key technologies used to protect public and private sector organizations, their operational systems, and their users. This role provides him a balanced opportunity to provide the need for good business protection at the same time to research the latest threat approaches. Andrew will be followed by John Michelsen. John is our Chief Product Officer here at Zimperium. John has more than 20 years of technical leadership experience and currently serves as Imperium's Chief Product Officer. He heads up product strategy and development and is sought out as a technical advisor to many. Today we're going to talk about what's going on in cybersecurity. We're going to discuss some of the requirement differences of endpoint protections and then how Zimperium detects threats. We've got a large audience today, so what we've done is we've assumed some frequently asked questions, and we'll actually be discussing those during the presentation. If you do have a question during the presentation, please enter it in the question window on the right-hand portion of your GoToWebinar screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Andrew Kellett of Ovum.
Thanks, Scott. So my plan for today is to take a look at how we got to where we are, hence what's going on in cybersecurity, and then focus on the endpoint and mobile device protection issues in the context of current security threats. So what's going on in cyber security and device protection? Well, an awful lot. Some of it is very positive, but a lot is not all good, and there's plenty to be concerned about. If we take a look at the evolution of the threat landscape as shown on the current slide, in the early 1990s, when I was working as a systems analyst and an operations manager for PC and laptop protection, you could get away with updating AV signatures monthly, and if we did that, we thought we were the good guys. And the mobile threat focus was on the ease with which analog phones could be hacked, cloned, and reused. I have to admit, my first virus infection was brought to me by the CEO of the company that I was working for, when his PA was stood by my desk and said, "Here's Ken's laptop, this needs fixing." So throughout the 90s, we were building layered protection approaches, and later in the decade and into the early 2000s, we continued to add to all the layers of protection that were around. And at the same time, things started to get more complex because every time that a new threat arrived, we were adding new layers of protection. Looking at the diagram, for me, the changeover between if you keep all the layers of protection in place, you'll be safe, and detect, mitigate, and remediate requirements happened round about the March 2011 timeline, when RSA suffered its advanced persistent threat breach. We very quickly moved on from the layered position to one where everyone was talking about organizations and the breaches that were going to happen, what was going to happen to the devices, how you could protect them. And everyone who had devices or servers breached were complaining that they were suffering from the APT plague. In reality, most organizations were being breached by standard off-the-shelf malware, and that continues to be the case today. So, if we look at what's going on today, today's answer to the security industry involves the use of more proactive user and device protection mechanisms. we've moved on quite a lot from the signature-based protections of yesteryear, but we haven't cleared them out. Use of next-generation sandboxing, for example, which seems to be a combination of multiple sandboxes and whitelisting and use of cloud-based threat identification services, and of course the ability to deal with sandbox-aware malware. UEBA, User Entity Behavior Analytics. I'm sure that's a Gartnerism. But it's about the ability to find and detect security breaches, tracking the behavior of users to see that they conform to expectations and looking for things that look to be clearly wrong. EDR, endpoint detection and incident response. So there's got to be an extra I in there somewhere. But the emphasis seems to have moved from detection with a greater need to fix things that have already happened, which is interesting because the initial argument in favor of this type of technology and similar was to remove less effective signature-based technologies. But to be honest, I'm not seeing that we've improved things too much. AI and ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities, not new technology, been around for a good while, but starting to be used more and more within the user, device and systems protection environment. Then of course, all roads seem to lead these days to security intelligence and the use that can be made of threat data as we look to do better things with the security information resources available to us. And everybody in the security space seems to have this huge amount of data that can be made available. So, thinking about the current situation. To summarize, we currently seem to have too many individual tools and security processes that claim to deal with the prevention of cyber threats. In reality, a lot of them only do small parts of the job. Threat identification success rates remain poor. The need to improve, for example, industry average security breach and remediation times that still stubbornly stay close to the 200-day mark is a major issue. And the fact that a lot of these security breaches are not being detected by the tools themselves, but by customers and regulators getting in touch with the organization and saying, hey, something looks wrong, we need to do better. So the requirements for endpoint and mobile device security brings us specifically to the area of device protection and the need to ensure that everything from the humble PC and laptop through to the latest smartphones and tablets are protected. Within business, we have to consider the use of multiple devices, the desire for users to switch between devices on a regular basis. And this includes company-owned, the mix of company-owned and user-owned devices. So bring your own device comes into the equation. After all, every device that can gain access to business systems needs to be protected. As a result of everything that's going on in the security industry, the spend on software security solutions continues to rise. Ovum estimates that the spend this current year will be around about US dollars 37 billion. 15%, probably a little bit more, will be spent on endpoint and mobile device protection. So the endpoint remains the driver. When we look at those numbers, to me, my research shows me that endpoint and Windows environments in particular remain the main spending drivers. And it has to be a concern that not enough focus is being placed on mobile threats. Our own reports, when we've looked at endpoint and mobile, we've tried to combine the two. Have to admit that when you do this, it's one of those where you end up comparing very different solutions. With today's open platform environments, it's clear we can't afford to focus everything on Windows to the exclusion of everything else. Now, Scott, I think this brings us to the first of your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. You talked a lot about the exclusion of other platforms in Windows and increasing spend. But how are we going to convince security teams that securing mobile devices are different? And then why don't you comment, and then we'll hand it over to John for some comments as well.
Okay. I mean, no doubt about it, the Windows first security approach needs to change. But because it's firmly entrenched in the enterprise mindset, it's not going to be easy to change. We need to raise the threat perspective of mobile device platforms, and with it, the users, the applications, and the data protection requirements. The case also needs to be put that if we continue to focus endpoint protection on Windows PCs to the exclusion of others, those other platforms will be targeted and will rapidly become the channel and platform of choice to launch cyber attacks. They will become the soft target, the low-hanging fruit, if you like.
Yeah, Andrew, you make a great point right there. Those who want to attack an organization are always motivated to find the path of least resistance. And as mobile devices have the type of assets and access that desktop endpoints do, clearly they become the path of least resistance. And yet they are very different. Mobile devices have a personal use aspect to them that makes the surveillance model or the no privacy expectations of most endpoint security solutions not applicable. They are not fixed wire devices. Instead, they roam around public Wi-Fi networks, and they're much more vulnerable to attack in that way. They run on devices where the company that produced or that owns the device, even in a corporate-owned device, is not the administrator of that device, but the user is the administrator of that device. In fact, the user always has greater control over the device than the administrator or the owner of the device. So there are so many ways that mobile devices make the challenge greater, and yet we see, Andrew, as you do, that there are too many instances where mobile is the path of least resistance. So I think there's clearly a difference, and that difference is something that hackers can take advantage of.
Yeah. And I think from our own research perspective, it's been difficult to put the two side by side. So either work needs to be done to combine the approaches that the security industry has, or we need better partnerships within the solutions. Because at the end of the day, enterprise organizations will use all these devices, and therefore the protection levels need to be, well, equal and consistent based on the access that people have.
Right.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. So with that, if we are going to focus on mobile devices, we hear about iOS and its safety record. So is that being overplayed, or is that real?
Well, over the years, there's been plenty of other technology examples where security has ended up as a bolt-on extra. With iOS, the stance is a little bit different insofar as it operates more like a closed platform. But the thing is, as a business target, iOS devices tend to have high net worth users, So execs, managers, they they're all seen as valuable targets. So yeah, as the recent Pegasus threat and its potential to jailbreak iOS devices without the owner's knowledge shows, bad things are starting to happen.
Yeah, and of course we have been protecting iOS devices for quite some time, and so we have full knowledge of the types of threats. In fact, I'm going to get to share some data on threats that are both on Android and on iOS devices. But I would just suggest a few things. First, um, I think I think every mobile platform out there has done an admirable job of securing its core. The challenge is that no large body of software is is perfect and has no unintended consequences and has no bugs that can be exploited. Even the most stable Linux kernel, we still have disclosures from time to time. And these mobile platforms are evolving to the tune of millions of lines of code every year still. These aren't just large bodies of code. These are still highly volatile bodies of code. So we can't even really think that there is a trend that will ever, at least in the mobile lifetime, if you will, right? In the mobile life cycle, we're still on the upside of adding complexity to these devices and expanding their use, et cetera. And as mobile evolves into more IoT style use cases, it's only going to get more and more a challenge to consider that these are kind of manufactured as safe. That just has never happened in computing, and iOS certainly has not proven to be an exception to that. In fact, just in the last 2 years, the CVE disclosures on iOS have outnumbered Android, and again are on the upswing in terms of number. And this is no fault of Apple or Google for that matter, or Windows as Windows 10 becomes more prevalent with Surface. It's just a reality of software, and those who want to innovate via attack or by exploitation have a large body of code with which to work. So we just have to be diligent about protecting the device, not assuming it's safe enough.
So, so when you look at this as an overarching issue for everything that you cover within this space with Imperium, um, how do you go about dealing with the separation between the mobile platforms themselves? Android is clearly seen as something that's less secure than iOS, but there are so many different devices, different levels of software out there. It's got to be a very complex problem.
Well, Andrew, it is. We've tried to make it as simple for customers, but on the inside our labs, we have our Android lab has to have an enormous number of devices, and the openness of the Android platform is what gives it both um, a larger surface area for attack, and it gives it some additional complexity to secure. So we've done, I think, a great job of handling that. And on the iOS side, the more closed that system is, or is perceived to be at least, people consider that it's harder to secure. In fact, we haven't had that much of a challenge securing that device, much less so than people would think. So there's actually education involved in both platforms. And again, as Windows 10 becomes more and more prevalent in tablets, and the nature of the way that a Windows 10 device will be attacked, a mobile Windows 10 device will be attacked versus a fixed wire desktop style or server style device. They're all three different, and so we've had to focus individually on them.
Yeah, that makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, whatever we say about the different platforms, we're still in a position where they are perceived as being less of a threat than the Windows environment. But over to you, Scott.
So yeah, we talk about the different platforms, and we're really interested in knowing what's the reality of a mobile threat. I know both of you guys talked about the Pegasus incident that happened last week. Are people going to discount that, or are we going to expect more attacks like that?
Hmm. I think, well, just as the natural evolution of things, we will see more attacks both on the Android and on the iOS side of things. Let's face it, what we're talking about is technology-based communications devices, and because they can be used to launch attacks, send malware to business systems, they're a valuable asset, a valuable target. Right back in the early 90s, thieves identified that there was a financial value to be gained from hijacking and cloning mobile devices, going digital, and then bringing in next generation smart devices, change the market and the threat dynamic. But at the same time, it opened it up to new malware, new opportunities, more advanced threat opportunities. So the problem isn't going to go away. It's only going to get more intense, and yeah, we will very quickly go through that advanced persistent threat stage with mobile.
Yeah, in fact, Andrew, one of the things that keeps us up at night is, as we say a lot, there are assets like emails and sensitive corporate information, personal information on a device, but access also. And so the weaponizing of a mobile device while it is outside the corporate network so that it can detonate an attack or launch an attack, essentially the springboard or the conduit to attacking an organization from the inside once that mobile device enters that network, is something that we have seen in the wild and we think is one of the, again, starting with the phrase we used earlier, the path of least resistance to get into an organization. The most vulnerable device being outside the network without the ability to do DPI and sandboxing email attachments, et cetera, while it's off network, and then bringing it inside the network so that it can start its attack, where inside the network traffic is much less frequently scrutinized. I think that's one of those classic use cases. I think that what is it, 12 months from now, 24 months from now, we're already seeing, but I think we'll actually have an expectation that this is in fact a common use case, not something we talk about in a webinar, but something we already know. It goes without saying.
Yeah, I think the market is starting to evolve. Take up of mobile device protection is growing, but I think we would both agree not fast enough. And given the experiences of other new technologies and the way that security has had to play catch up, I think the time is now really to do a better job of protecting those mobile devices. I don't know whether that's the natural lead into what you're wanting to talk about, John, but there is an awful lot more work still to be done.
Right, agreed. And thanks, Andrew, for the transition. We obviously believe that, and not only as a company, but obviously when you shift your career from other companies into a company like Zimperium, essentially each individual inside the company makes that same commitment to themselves, right? We essentially think, as you just said, Andrew, we're way too vulnerable in mobile devices, and as professionals in this world, we think that we can do something about that. So what I'll do with just a few minutes of time that I've got some slides prepared, I'll help our audience take a look at what is the nature of mobile threats. What have we seen? We have now year over year data from a number of customers, because this is a relatively nascent space. And we are one of the leaders in it. We were founded in 2010. Not many people were thinking about protecting mobile devices. In fact, it was early in trying to even identify how to attack a mobile device in 2010, and we were studying how to protect. So we have a large body of data and knowledge and some experience here. So I'll spend some time on that, and then I'll get into what it takes to actually secure a mobile device, because there are some differences as we've highlighted. So here is, I think, a very interesting graph. This essentially shows you the risk perspective of a customer of ours that happens to be a tech company on the West Coast of the US. And this is not threats that were delivered to the device. This is the risk profile of the devices. So let's put it this way. All those emails that come from the security team or the mobile ops team, hey, you really need to top up your firmware, or watch what apps you run, or don't download outside of Google Play, those things we all know go largely unlistened to. But what our software is able to do, and let me describe that as even without our software, but the company's perspective is that only about half of the devices that were accessing email, SharePoint, whatever it was, were safe enough to do that, that were low enough risk. That's what that dark green bar is. And what happened when they deployed our solution is that 60%, right, roughly by this area graph, 60% of the devices that we deployed to lost their access to email, SharePoint, again, whatever that was, because the company said, if the risk of this device to attack is such and such, we don't feel it's safe enough for us to entitle that device and give it access. So all of a sudden, thousands of users lost their access. But of course, then they started listening to the emails, because everyone wants to be able to get access to their corporate systems while they're away from the office. So most of them, right? You see that vulnerability mitigated graph there. Many of those actually went through the process of updating firmware, removing known malware, turning off some of the the weakening security conditions that you can do on a phone. Now, that means that they got their email and SharePoint access back, which is great, right? This actually is a net reduction in risk for this organization. This is, of course, a goal of every security team, and something we can all be proud of. We actually can set a policy. We want safer devices. We want to be able to take the proper best practice steps, and we can enforce that. The far right of this area graph shows you the breakdown of the things that are still the case, by the way, as of the last time we took a snapshot of this particular customer, where these conditions mean that those devices are still not entitled to access, and the company is quite comfortably saying, if this is the condition of your device, you should not, in fact, be accessing our systems with that device. But maybe even more important, what about live threats? What about I'm at a coffee shop. I'm surfing out on the Gulf Coast, or I'm wherever, and my device is vulnerable to attack. What about that? Do we see them? Where do they come from? What is the nature of those types of threats? Well, let's start with some good news. There's a fair number, right? We'll say almost 90% of the devices that at this particular company over 4 months' time. By the way, this is a 4-month snapshot. Over this 4 months of time, almost 90% of these devices had either no threat at all, or a threat that you would consider low severity, only potentially a threat. Scanning activities, you see TCP scan, UDP scan, ARP scans, those can be normal behavior. TCP scans are not typically, especially repeated TCP scans, are not typically normal behavior. That could be reconnaissance scanning. Reconnaissance is very important for a hacker. He or she needs to know what type of device it is, what version of the device of operating system it's running, what sites you connect to, what apps you're running. So those scans can be a problem, but they aren't usually a problem. So that gets us in this area graph down to thankfully a relatively small number, but that relatively small is still almost 5%. So if we had started this webinar and we had said, in a 4-month period for a typical technology company in the US, what percentage of their devices would you think would have a legitimate mobile threat delivered, a clearly legitimate mobile threat? My hunch is none of you would have said 5%. My hunch is you guys would have found, well, I read a report that 1% of all the Androids have malware on them, so maybe it's 1%, or maybe it's 1.5%, or something like that. But in fact, it's closer to 5%. And this is not a number that is unique to this particular company or this instance. We could just as easily be showing data from any number of our partners or individual customers almost anywhere in the world and have a fairly similar breakdown. Additional summary, because you can kind of get a sense for what we're looking at here. Of course, we actually do see about 1% of the devices with malware on them. consistent with other threat reports. But our detections go much deeper than malware. We get in very deep into network threats and device level exploit as well. So in fact, you see a number of those actually occurring. Here's some good takeaways. About 70% of the threats we see, of the real critical threats, are network type threats. What that essentially means is that they're compromising the data connection or the cell connection of the device. It's not a matter of the platform can do anything about those. In fact, those are vulnerable protocols that the device is using. And so many of these have to do with degrading SSL so that you think you're having a secure conversation when you're not, or they actually redirect your traffic into a man in the middle so that they can do, again, deep reconnaissance, manipulate your traffic, any number of things. So there's a lot of different assets you can look at here in this particular threat report, but there's some summary. Device level exploit under 1%, network threats certainly about 3-4% in malware. So continuing, pardon us, there we go. So how do you properly secure a mobile device? And we've already described that it's different than a traditional desktop or server type endpoint. It starts with vulnerability and risk. It has to start with vulnerability. The reason is because these platforms are changing so quickly. The CVE counts are growing, not shrinking. So it's very important for us to focus on becoming less hackable. So we've got to always start with risk. So that's the first piece. And that includes, by the way, not just from an app perspective of malware, which I'll talk about in a second, but privacy abuses, permissions abuses in apps, security issues in apps like backdoors and inappropriate coding practices of the apps that are running on these devices. So risk is a big piece. The second, obviously, is network attacks, because, of course, we just saw almost 70% of the threats in that particular case were network in nature. And network isn't discriminatory, by the way. Network threats are generally the same, whether it's an iOS device, an Android, or Windows 10 device. So when we hear that iOS is safe, isn't it, and we see that 70% of the threats are network threats, and they don't discriminate, of course, that really does solve for the equation of is iOS vulnerable right there. Network attacks, really important aspect. And of course, malware. Now we see some malware in iOS. We do see more on Android. The good news here is I think malware is one that the platforms, Google, Apple, others, are actually able to do something about, and they are doing something about. I think there's an admirable job on the Google side to do more and more malware research inside the platform itself and to help us with that particular problem. It's still there. It's still going to be there. They'll never be able to solve it 100%, but they're doing a lot to make that better. And then the real challenge, and by the way, this is Pegasus, this is stage fright, this is so many of those core device level vulnerabilities. Essentially, device exploitation is where an attacker can get a payload onto your phone, whether through a network attack or through malware download or Safari or Chrome content in a browser, however they do, that is able to essentially disable the security of your device and give them root level or sufficient administrator type privileges on that device. That's what device exploitation is. And those are, of course, the greatest challenge, because that means that, in fact, the hacker has more access and control of your device than even you do as a user. So we have to be able to detect for these things, because that's how we find the 0-day problems. We want to be able to know that Pegasus was infecting a device before it was known and disclosed and named, right? What if the activist in Dubai, wasn't it Dubai, right? UAE, had never actually clicked on the link, but didn't give that to the Citizen Labs folks? We would still not know about Pegasus, and we would all still be vulnerable to the Trident vulnerabilities. But instead, though that one was discovered, but it's all the as yet undiscovered threats that we still have to be able to detect. And that's what device exploitation detection is. So we've talked a little bit about how the corporate desktop has no expectation of privacy. It was one of the differences between mobile and traditional security techniques. So in fact, we consider that essentially the corporate desktop, when you have deep packet inspection, you've got a web gateway, you've got email scanning and all of this stuff, right? The company is reading your emails, looking at all your web pages, deciding what you can and can't go access, and all of that is totally fine. None of us have an expectation of privacy in our corporate desktops. We shouldn't, right? And in fact, we have um, we have a sufficient body of proof that the company needs to be able to read all that traffic in order to secure it. The problem is the hybrid use world of mobile devices. We can't use these classic security style methodologies. We have to use a detection type methodology. So that's the difference, the biggest difference in our view between that's the biggest difference we see between the traditional security approaches and a mobile security approach. You've got to be able to do detection on device. So we have to think of securing mobile devices differently. That's why the most important aspect of our technology is on-device detection. We don't want to be scanning emails and reading web pages through some third party the way that you can a corporate desktop. You really can't do that appropriately on a mobile device. You certainly don't want that happening on a Saturday afternoon while you're taking pictures of the kids at a soccer game and you're trading messages with your friends. It's just not appropriate for companies to be scanning that particular content, and yet they need security. So on-device detection is the way to go. And there's one other aspect to this, and I know that I bet that, again, if I'd asked you the question right up at the beginning, you're about to hear a webinar on mobile security. What are you expecting to hear? Well, the mobile devices need security software, and that you need to run an app on your phone and connect it to the MDM and all of that stuff. And it's absolutely true, right? The corporate security model, or to secure the mobile productivity use case, we obviously need to produce an app to integrate that with whatever management systems you might be using. Maybe there is an EMM or MDM in your environment. Maybe there's not, and we integrate to your identity access management system or your network security system. But basically, there's an app to deliver to all of those corporately connected devices. But there's another whole half of the mobile security world, and that is that many of you work for companies that produce apps that get deployed into an unmanaged world. They land on your customers' phones or tablets, and you don't get to decide what the security posture of those. You don't get to say you don't get to run my app if you don't top up your firmware, or I know you're running malware, so I'm not going to run my app. In fact, many of us produce apps that are deployed through these public app stores, and we have no ability to control or manage what the security posture of those devices is. So we need to protect our app running in that wild west, if you will, of who knows what device is running it. To do that, we produce the same detection technology as an SDK. We call it Zimperium's in-app protection. So you can actually embed our detection engine into your app, and it becomes just another part of your app, so that if the device is compromised, if the network is compromised, if an app attacks your app, then we can do a detection of that real time, and you can take steps to remediate that threat inside the application. The classic example is any e-commerce or banking or financial services type app, but of course, anyone that is trading sensitive information would be really important to do. So those are the two main use cases. Deliver an app to your employees and contractors, deliver ZApp, which is an SDK, into your apps so that that is how you protect all of your consumers who use your own applications. So that's essentially where we stand as Imperium. Mobile threats are real. The nature of the threat is significant in the network, certainly in malware and in device level exploit. The approach is unique to mobile because of the hybrid personal use and because of the small form factor, the roaming networks, et cetera. And Andrew, I think that between the two different halves of the presentation, I think we've covered quite a bit. Scott, are there any questions that look like something we should address at this time?
Yeah, if anyone has a question, please enter it in the right-hand side. We'll get to that if we're able to, but so I'll throw one out there, John, while people are typing away. We've heard about mobile platforms. Are they real? How do I see the data? What are some of the steps that these guys can take to help their security teams educate themselves? What do they need to do? Hey, security team, you should do. What should they do?
Yeah. So if you're trying to get a sense for what is essentially this webinar, hopefully would be a start to that, because I think between Andrew's material and ours, I think we did set the table for that conversation, that mobile is an endpoint, that threats are real on that endpoint. Andrew's comment, I think, is certainly salient. Your attacker is going to take the path of least resistance, and mobile appears to be that right now. So I think that certainly begins that conversation. And then, of course, we can privately share more and more details on what the threat looks like at different types of companies. Maybe you're in the financial services world, and we can help you see what other financial services companies types of mobile threats look like, and some of the things that they're doing, right? So we can share some information. And I bet that Ovum has plenty, in addition to what Andrew has provided us today, that can get us some background.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Certainly on the mobile side of things and on the bring your own device environment, we've got a lot of information about how people use these devices, the likelihood of them bringing them into the corporate environment, the numbers that support the different types of usage, and the way that people want to use these devices. I think it's an interesting conversation to have in terms of when people bring a device into the work environment, how we separate that personal use. And I think you were starting to talk about it a little earlier in terms of personal use during private time. But recognizing that those devices will be holding both personal data and potentially sensitive company information, and there has to be a level of control that's applied to ensure that the organization itself can stay safe and can be reasonably assured that that they're providing the users with a fast and efficient way of accessing information, but at the same time that information stays safe.
Right, Andrew. And as you were speaking and thinking about the question that was posed to us, I think there's one more thing I would add, Scott, real quick, and that is that there's nothing more enlightening than to see a live demonstration of a hack on a mobile device. Because I think we have the perception that these things are at least hard to hack, when in fact there are so many easy off-the-shelf ways to do fairly dangerous or high-value hacks on them. So I would add that to the list of things. So there's certainly some education, but a live demonstration of, hey, you think your phone is safe. Let's not use someone's actual phone, because we don't want to see their real passwords and we don't want to see real content. But let's bring a phone in that has dummy data on it. Let's attack it and see just how vulnerable they are. I think that would be another piece of the puzzle.
Perfect. So in terms of endpoints, if mobile are endpoints too, are all the mobile endpoints vulnerable?
I think you have to look at the bigger picture here. As a security analyst, and I guess from the outside looking in, I like to take the simplistic approach of saying if they're endpoints that can access business systems, then they've got to be protected. Where does mobile start and finish? Well, maybe you would say that the PCs in the office are not mobile devices, but the laptop that you can put underneath your arm and walk out with certainly is. And so I guess we start somewhere around there, and then we have to look at all the different devices that are likely to have access to business systems, and not just tying individuals down to one device, but the ability to manage the collection of devices that an individual user is likely to use.
Okay, appreciate that, Andrew. Any closing thoughts from you and John?
I'll start. I appreciate the audience joining. It was great to have a large show, turnout and to have this discussion. Appreciate the many questions we didn't get to, so our folks will follow up with those.
And from our side of things, it was a good opportunity to do a bit more research into the complete area of endpoint and mobile device protection. It's something that we will be looking at going forward. It's important to business organizations to put themselves into a position of doing a better job of protecting all the devices that access their systems. And yeah, from our point of view, there can't be any exclusions.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, John, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'd encourage you to go and visit ovum.com and check out some of the mobile endpoint research that Ovum provides, and Zimperium.com for product information and resources to educate your security team. So with that, this is Scott, and I will sign off. Thanks again for everyone for joining. Bye.